Were medieval women just docile figures trapped in castles, always pregnant, and totally ignored by history? Do you think they spent their days only spinning yarn and obeying every command? The period from roughly 500 AD to 1500 AD holds many surprises about women. Number 1. Medieval women were silent and subservient. Many stories and popular images paint medieval women as quiet figures, always in the background, speaking only when spoken to, and never challenging authority. This picture often shows them as meek and entirely submissive, their voices rarely heard in the halls of power or even in their own homes. The belief is that their lives were lived in constant obedience, with no room for personal expression or opinion. People often imagine a world where women held no sway, where their thoughts and desires were utterly suppressed by a male-dominated society. This idea suggests that women simply accepted their lot without question, never rising above the roles assigned to them by tradition or law. The common understanding presents a monotonous existence, devoid of any significant influence or personal power for women. They are often seen as props in a grander narrative, rather than active participants shaping their own destinies or the world around them. Yet, historical records reveal a much more complex reality, showing that medieval women were far from silent. They expressed themselves in various ways, through their art, their writings, their religious devotion, and sometimes even through direct confrontation. One powerful example is Hildegard of Bingen, a German abbess, writer, composer, philosopher, mystic, and visionary who lived in the 12th century. She corresponded with popes, emperors, and kings, offering them advice and sometimes sharp criticism. Hildegard did not shy away from sharing her opinions or her visions, which she believed came directly from God. Her writings, such as Scivias, are filled with detailed descriptions of her theological and cosmic insights. She also composed numerous musical pieces, including the Ordo Virtutum, a morality play with a complex musical score. Hildegard established her own independent monastery, pushing against male ecclesiastical authority to gain control over her community. When her community faced an interdict from the church, preventing them from receiving sacraments and singing, Hildegard directly challenged the archbishop, arguing against the injustice of the situation. Her arguments were persuasive enough that the interdict was eventually lifted. Her voice, through her extensive writings and her public actions, clearly resonated across Europe, proving that a medieval woman could indeed speak loudly and be heard. Another woman whose voice broke through the prevailing norms was Christine de Pizan, who lived in France in the late 14th and early 15th centuries. After being widowed, Christine supported herself and her family by writing. She became one of the first professional female writers in Europe. Her most famous work, The Book of the City of Ladies, directly challenged the misogynistic literature of her time. In this book, she debated negative stereotypes about women, presenting instead a collection of admirable female figures from history, mythology, and religion. Christine actively defended women's intelligence, their moral worth, and their capacity for leadership and learning. She participated in intellectual debates, such as the Querelle du Roman de la Rose, where she openly criticized Jean de Monts' popular poem for its negative portrayal of women. Christine's writings were widely read and circulated, influencing thought at the French royal court and beyond. Her sharp intellect and her determination to defend women's honor were evident in every page she wrote, demonstrating a powerful and articulate female voice in a period often thought to suppress such expressions. Beyond these famous figures, evidence of women's voices appears in less formal ways. In medieval courts, women frequently testified, bringing complaints, defending themselves, and representing their families. For example, in manorial courts across England, women often appeared to resolve disputes, secure property, or claim inheritances. Records from these courts show women speaking plainly and often forcefully to defend their interests. In the court rules of the Manor of Wakefield, for instance, numerous entries document women initiating legal actions, arguing their cases, and engaging in complex legal procedures. These women from various social strata clearly knew their rights and were not afraid to assert them publicly. They held property, made contracts, and participated in the economic life of their communities, often requiring them to speak up and negotiate. Even within domestic settings, women were not always meek. The household accounts and letters reveal wives managing estates, instructing servants, and engaging in financial transactions. A letter from Agnes Paston to her husband John in the 15th century, part of the extensive Paston Letters collection, shows Agnes actively managing their family estates in Norfolk, dealing with rebellious tenants, collecting rents, and defending their property rights. Her letters are full of practical advice and firm instructions, demonstrating her authority and decisiveness in her husband's absence. She was not merely a passive recipient of orders, but an active manager, making decisions and holding her own against challenges. These letters provide a glimpse into the significant administrative roles many wives held, roles that required them to speak with authority and resolve problems. Furthermore, women in religious orders often held significant power and exercised considerable influence. Abbesses like Hildegard governed large communities of nuns, managing vast estates, overseeing finances, and providing spiritual guidance. They often had direct access to powerful secular and ecclesiastical leaders, serving as spiritual advisors or political intermediaries. For instance, in England, abbesses such as the Abbess of Barking or the Abbess of Romsey controlled substantial lands and resources, equivalent to many male barons. They administered justice within their monastic territories and sometimes even minted their own coins. Their positions required strong leadership, negotiation skills, and the ability to command respect, all of which contradict the image of the silent, subservient woman. Women also contributed to oral traditions and storytelling, acting as keepers of folklore and transmitters of knowledge. Although much of this oral history is not formally recorded, the presence of female characters with strong voices and agency in medieval literature, such as Chaucer's Wife of Bath, suggests that such figures existed in society. The Wife of Bath, a strong and opinionated character, discusses her experiences with multiple marriages and her views on women's roles, directly challenging prevailing societal norms through her vibrant and outspoken monologue. While fictional, characters like her reflect a social awareness that women were not always quiet. Even women in lower social classes, such as peasant women, were far from silent. They participated in agricultural labor, market trade, and community events where they interacted, negotiated, and voiced their opinions. Disputes over property, debts, or neighborhood conflicts often involved women speaking their minds. Court records show women engaging in arguments, making accusations, and defending their honor. These interactions, while often local, demonstrate a lively and vocal presence in daily life, far removed from the image of complete silence. The variety of ways in which medieval women express themselves, from the scholarly treatises of Christine de Pizan to the practical managerial letters of Agnes Paston, and the court testimonies of everyday women, clearly dismantles the myth of universal female subservience and silence. Their voices echoed through literature, legal documents, and the very fabric of their societies, proving their active participation and undeniable influence. Number 2. Medieval women were universally uneducated. A persistent belief about medieval women is that they were largely uneducated. This idea often suggests that literacy and formal learning were almost exclusively for men, especially clergy or nobles. The image is of women confined to household tasks with no access to books, schools, or intellectual pursuits. Many imagine that reading and writing were rare skills for women, making them dependent on men for information and knowledge. This myth suggests that intellectual development was not considered important for women and that their minds were left untrained, focusing only on practical skills like weaving or cooking. The prevailing thought is that education was a privilege reserved for a select few men, completely bypassing the female population. However, historical evidence demonstrates that medieval women, across different social classes, engaged in various forms of education and intellectual activity. While formal schooling was not universally available to everyone, male or female, opportunities for learning existed and were often seized by women. In convents and monasteries, women received extensive education, and nuns were expected to read Latin, the language of the church, to understand scripture and liturgical texts. Many convents maintained impressive libraries and served as centers of learning, where women studied theology, philosophy, music, and the arts. Abbesses were often highly educated scholars who composed works of their own, oversaw scribal workshops, and managed complex institutions. For example, Roswitha of Gandersheim, a 10th century German canoness, wrote Latin dramas inspired by Terence, historical chronicles, and poetry. Her works demonstrate a deep classical education and remarkable literary skill. She even composed biographical texts about the lives of saints and empresses. Roswitha's writings circulated and were admired, showing that a woman could achieve significant intellectual renown within the monastic setting. These monastic schools for women were not just places of spiritual devotion, they were also vital educational institutions that fostered female scholarship and literacy, directly contradicting the notion of widespread female illiteracy. Beyond convents, noble women often received a comprehensive education, especially those destined for positions of power or influence. They learned to read and write, often in multiple languages, to manage large estates, oversee household accounts, and engage in diplomacy. Eleanor of Aquitaine, one of the most powerful women of the 12th century, was known for her exceptional education. She was literate in Latin and French, patronized poets and scholars, and accumulated an impressive library. Her political acumen and intellectual curiosity were shaped by her learning. Many aristocratic women were tutored at home by chaplains or governesses, ensuring they could read religious texts, chivalric romances, and practical manuals for estate management. For instance, the Book of the Knight of Latour Landry, a late 14th century text, was explicitly written for his daughters, filled with moral lessons and advice, implying that they were literate enough to read and absorb such instruction. Such texts were common in noble households. Even among urban mercantile classes, women often received practical education necessary for business. Wives and daughters in merchant families frequently assisted in running shops, managing accounts, and keeping ledgers. This required basic literacy and numeracy. In Italian city-states like Florence and Venice, women of the merchant elite were often educated to a degree that allowed them to participate actively in family businesses. The records of Francesco Dattini, a 14th century merchant from Prato, reveal letters exchanged with his wife, Margherita Dattini, showing her managing the business in his absence and discussing financial matters in detail. Her letters demonstrate a clear command of written language and arithmetic, essential skills for her role. These women were not just learning to sign their names, they were engaging with complex financial documents and correspondence, a testament to their practical education. While not as widespread, evidence of literacy among women of lower social status also exists. In some English parishes, dame schools run by women offered basic instruction in reading, writing, and arithmetic. These were informal schools where children, including girls, could learn fundamental skills. Wills and court documents sometimes show women making their own marks or signatures, though this varied greatly. The growth of devotional literature in the vernacular, such as books of hours and prayer books, suggests a rising tide of literacy among the general population, including women who wish to read these texts for their personal spiritual practice. Many women own these books, indicating their ability to read them. For example, the Book of Hours of Jeanne d'Evreux is a beautiful illuminated manuscript created for the French queen in the 14th century, intended for her personal devotion, which she would have read herself. The proliferation of craft guilds in medieval towns also offered a form of specialized education to women. Women worked as artisans, often alongside their husbands or fathers, in trades like brewing, weaving, tailoring, and goldsmithing. An apprenticeship, while not formal schooling in the modern sense, was a rigorous form of education that taught not just manual skills, but also business practices, material knowledge, and sometimes even reading and writing related to their trade. Guild regulations sometimes specified the training of daughters or widows in a craft, enabling them to continue the family business. For instance, in Paris, women were prominent in silk weaving and embroidery guilds, managing their own workshops and training apprentices. This technical and vocational education, while different from academic learning, was crucial for their economic independence and contribution to society. Furthermore, medieval women were often educated in the arts and sciences, albeit often informally. So women served as healers and midwives, requiring extensive knowledge of herbal remedies, anatomy, and medical practices. This knowledge was often passed down through generations, a sophisticated form of practical education. Some women, like Trotta of Salerno in the 12th century, are recognized as significant medical practitioners and writers. Trotta's works, particularly De Curis Mulierum, on treatments for women, discuss gynecological conditions and childbirth, demonstrating her advanced medical knowledge and literary output. While the authorship is debated, her work reflects a tradition where women were central to medical knowledge. The evidence points to a diverse educational landscape for medieval women, ranging from high-level monastic scholarship and aristocratic literary pursuits to practical literacy for urban trades and informal vocational training. To claim that medieval women were universally uneducated is to overlook the many ways in which they acquired and applied knowledge, contributing intellectually and practically to their societies. Their access to learning varied significantly by social class, location, and individual circumstances, but it was far from absent or unimportant. Number 3. Medieval women were confined to the home and domestic roles. A widespread misconception depicts medieval women as almost entirely confined to their homes, their lives revolving solely around domestic duties such as cooking, cleaning, and child-rearing. This myth often presents an image of women as isolated from public life, rarely venturing beyond their immediate household and having no involvement in the wider community or economy. It suggests a strict division of labor where men were the public figures and providers, while women were solely private homemakers, their activities limited to a narrow domestic sphere. The idea is that women had no roles outside the confines of the home, no engagement with the bustling markets, the political arenas, or the agricultural fields. However, historical records clearly demonstrate that medieval women were active participants in nearly every aspect of public, economic, and social life. Their roles extended far beyond the domestic sphere, often out of necessity, contributing significantly to their families' livelihoods and to the broader economy. In rural areas, which comprised the vast majority of medieval society, peasant women were indispensable to agricultural production. They worked alongside men in the fields, performing arduous tasks such as planting, weeding, harvesting, and gathering fuel. The medieval calendar and numerous illuminated manuscripts depict women participating in all stages of agricultural labor, from plowing to threshing. For example, in the Tres Riches du Ductebary, women are shown harvesting, gleaning, and even participating in sheep shearing. And women were also responsible for tending livestock, milking cows, and processing agricultural products like making cheese or brewing ale. This agricultural work was physically demanding and essential for survival, clearly placing women directly in the public, outdoor sphere of labor. Their work was not confined to the home, it was integral to the rural economy. In medieval towns and cities, women were highly visible and active in a wide range of trades and crafts. They worked as merchants, shopkeepers, artisans, and laborers. Guild records often show women as members, masters, and apprentices in various trades. For instance, in cities like London and Paris, women were prominent in the textile industry, working as wool sorters, spinners, weavers, and dyers. Many women ran their own businesses, especially if they were widows who inherited their husband's trade. Alice Kniveton, a widow in 14th century London, successfully ran a large drapery business after her husband's death, importing cloths and dealing with international merchants. This demonstrates women's direct involvement in commerce and trade beyond the domestic space. Women were also central to the food and drink industry. Brewing ale and baking bread were often considered women's work, and many women ran their own alehouses or bakeries. These businesses operated out of their homes but involved public interaction, sales, and often managing staff. Alewives were common figures in medieval towns, providing a crucial commodity to the community. Court records sometimes mention women being fined for selling substandard ale, which confirms their active participation in the market economy. Their stalls in the marketplace, their presence in the streets selling their wares, and their interaction with customers all show them actively participating in the public sphere. Beyond manual labor and trade, women held influential roles in various professions. They served as midwives and healers, providing essential medical care to their communities. This often involved visiting homes, diagnosing illnesses, and preparing remedies, putting them in frequent public contact. Some women were skilled scribes and illuminators, producing books and manuscripts, often for a fee. The Book of the City of Ladies by Christine de Pizan mentions women who were master painters, sculptors, and musicians, suggesting that such skilled professions were not entirely closed off to them. Women ran schools, often known as dame schools, teaching basic literacy to children, both boys and girls, from their communities. Even within noble and royal households, women's roles extended beyond simply running the domestic staff. Queens and noblewomen often managed vast estates, supervised numerous servants, handled intricate financial accounts, and participated in political negotiations. They often hosted visitors, presided over courtly events, and engaged in diplomatic correspondence. Eleanor of Aquitaine, as Queen of France and later Queen of England, traveled extensively, campaigned with her husband, and even led her own troops on crusade. She was not confined to a single castle, but moved between residences, attended councils, and held immense political power. Lady Margaret Beaufort, mother of King Henry VII, was a shrewd businesswoman and political operator who managed enormous landholdings and sponsored numerous charitable and educational initiatives in the late 15th century. Her life was a testament to a woman's ability to operate effectively and powerfully in the public domain. In religious life, abbesses and prioresses held significant administrative and spiritual authority, governing large monastic communities and their extensive landholdings. They interacted with secular rulers, bishops, and other powerful figures, making decisions that affected hundreds of people and substantial resources. Their offices were not domestic, but public, requiring leadership, financial acumen, and diplomatic skill. For example, the Abbess of Fontevraud in France governed a double monastery, housing both monks and nuns, and controlled vast estates, demonstrating her authority over men and women alike in a significant public role. Furthermore, medieval women actively participated in social and community life. They attended church, market fairs, festivals, and legal proceedings. Women were members of confraternities and guilds, which were social and religious organizations that provided mutual aid and community support. These gatherings were not private affairs, but public forums for interaction, networking, and social engagement. Their presence in these varied settings, from fields to market squares, from workshops to monastic cloisters, and from courts to royal palaces, vividly illustrates that the notion of medieval women being confined exclusively to the home is a gross oversimplification. They were dynamic and essential contributors to the social, economic, and political landscape of the Middle Ages. Number 4, medieval women had no legal rights or property ownership. A common misconception is that medieval women possessed almost no legal rights and were incapable of owning property independently. This view often portrays women as legal minors, perpetually under the guardianship of a father, husband, or other male relative, with no control over their own assets or even their own decisions. The idea suggests that any property associated with a woman automatically passed to her husband upon marriage, leaving her with no economic standing or legal agency. People often imagine a system where women were completely disenfranchised, unable to enter into contracts, bring lawsuits, or make wills, thus rendering them entirely dependent on men for their economic and legal existence. However, historical legal systems in the Middle Ages, while certainly patriarchal, often granted women significant rights regarding property and legal standing, varying by region, social class, and marital status. One of the most important concepts for women's property rights in many parts of medieval Europe was dower or dowry. While the dowry was typically property a bride brought into a marriage which legally became her husband's to manage, it was often designated to support her if she became a widow. The dower, on the other hand, was the portion of her husband's estate set aside for her support upon his death. In England, a widow was typically entitled to 1/3 of her deceased husband's lands for the duration of her life. This was her dower right, and it was a powerful legal protection. She had a life interest in this property, meaning she could live off its income, manage it, and even sue to protect her rights to it. This guaranteed a widow some measure of economic independence and security, preventing her from being destitute. Records from manorial courts and royal courts are filled with cases where widows assert their dower rights against relatives or other claimants. Beyond dower, single women, including spinsters and widows, had many of the same legal rights as men. They could own land, inherit property, enter into contracts, conduct business, and appear in court as plaintiffs or defendants. A single woman was considered feme sole, a woman on her own in common law, and she had full legal capacity. For example, Eleanor of Provence, the widowed Queen of England, after the death of Henry III, actively managed her dower lands, negotiated treaties, and acted as a powerful political figure, demonstrating her legal and economic autonomy. Many medieval wills show single women bequeathing property, naming executors, and making complex arrangements for their estates, a clear sign of their property ownership and legal agency. Married women's legal standing was more complex under common law, often falling under the legal principle of coverture, where the legal identity of the wife was subsumed by that of her husband. However, coverture was not absolute. While a married woman generally could not own property independently or enter into contracts without her husband's consent, there were significant exceptions and customs that softened its impact. In many urban centers, especially in England, the custom of feme sole merchant existed. This allowed married women who ran their own businesses to be treated as single women for the purpose of their trade. They could sue and be sued, incur debts, and enter into contracts related to their business without their husband's involvement. This custom was crucial for women working in trades like brewing, baking, and textile production, enabling them to participate actively in the urban economy. The records from London's civic courts show many cases involving married women acting as feme sole merchants, highlighting their legal recognition in business dealings. Furthermore, medieval women often had rights to inherit personal property. Daughters frequently received movable goods, such as jewelry, clothing, household furnishings, or money, as their inheritance, even if land passed to sons. In some regions, especially in parts of Scandinavia and areas with customary law, daughters could even inherit land equally with sons in the absence of male heirs. For instance, in parts of Sweden, women had customary rights to land inheritance that were more extensive than in many other European regions. Women also played significant roles in the transmission of property through their roles as trustees, fiefs, and executors of wills. A man might grant land to a group of fiefs, including his wife, to ensure the land eventually went to his chosen heirs or for charitable purposes. Women were frequently named as executors of their husbands' wills, giving them considerable power to manage and distribute the deceased's estate, pay debts, and oversee the execution of his last wishes. This role required legal acumen and the ability to navigate the intricacies of property law. Records from the archdeaconry courts in England, which handled probate, show countless examples of women serving as executors, demonstrating their trust and legal competence. Ecclesiastical courts also provided avenues for women to pursue legal claims, particularly in matters related to marriage, dowry, and moral offenses. Women could bring cases for breach of promise of marriage, spousal abuse, or divorce, though divorce was rare and usually involved annulment. These courts sometimes offered protection that secular courts did not, and women frequently used them to assert their rights or seek justice. For example, in the consistory courts, women could accuse men of defamation or sexual misconduct, demonstrating their ability to leverage legal channels for personal redress. Even land charters and legal deeds sometimes list women as witnesses or parties to transactions, showing their direct involvement in legal agreements. While they might be identified as a wife or daughter of a specific man, their inclusion in these formal documents indicates a legal presence and a recognized role in land dealings. In summary, the notion that medieval women had no legal rights or property ownership is a simplistic generalization that fails to account for the nuances of medieval legal systems. While specific limitations existed, particularly for married women under common law, various legal protections, customs, and exceptions allowed women to own property, manage assets, conduct business, and engage in legal proceedings. The widows and single women, in particular, often wielded substantial legal and economic power, proving that medieval women were far from legally powerless. Number 5. Medieval women had no agency in marriage. A pervasive myth suggests that medieval women had absolutely no say in their own marriages, that they were merely pawns in dynastic alliances or economic transactions, forced into unions arranged entirely by their fathers or male guardians. This perspective often portrays women as passive objects, dragged to the altar without a whisper of personal consent or preference. It implies that emotional connection or individual choice played no role, and that the only consideration was the benefit to the family, property, or political power. This widespread belief paints a bleak picture of women's marital lives, devoid of any personal agency or influence over such a fundamental life decision. However, historical evidence reveals a more nuanced reality where women, particularly those of higher social standing, sometimes had significant agency in marriage, and even common women had recognized avenues for expressing consent or dissent. While arranged marriages were common, especially among the nobility, the concept of consent was legally and ecclesiastically important. In the eyes of the church, which held immense influence over marriage laws, the free consent of both parties, male and female, was essential for a valid marriage. A marriage without mutual consent was considered invalid. While this principle did not always translate into full freedom of choice in practice, it meant that outright coercion could lead to an annulment. Ecclesiastical courts heard cases where individuals, including women, sought annulments based on lack of consent, sometimes successfully. This religious doctrine gave women a legal basis to resist forced unions, even if such resistance was difficult and carried social risks. For example, Eleanor of Aquitaine, one of the most powerful women of the 12th century, famously sought and obtained an annulment from King Louis VII of France, partly on grounds of consanguinity, but also arguably influenced by personal compatibility before quickly marrying Henry Plantagenet. Her capacity to make such profound personal and political choice highlights the agency some noble women possessed. Among the aristocracy, while marriages were indeed strategic alliances, women often had an influential, though not always decisive, voice. Noble daughters were valuable assets, and their families sought to secure advantageous matches. However, the women themselves were sometimes consulted, especially if the match involved a foreign ruler or a significant shift in status. Their personal inclinations or strong objections could influence the final decision. For instance, in the late 12th century, Margaret of France, daughter of Louis VII, was betrothed to Henry the Young King. Her own desires, though rarely the sole deciding factor, were not entirely ignored, and she was expected to embrace her new role with some degree of enthusiasm. Political and social considerations often necessitated at least the outward appearance of consent. The widows, in particular, had much greater autonomy in choosing whether to remarry and whom. A wealthy widow, especially one with significant dower lands, was a highly desirable catch. She often had the freedom to choose a second husband or to remain single and manage her own affairs. Her decision could be a powerful statement of personal choice and independence. For example, during the Hundred Years' War, numerous English and French widows, holding substantial estates, actively negotiated their remarriages, often using their property as leverage. They were not simply given away, they chose their partners based on their own interests and preferences. The will of Lady Alice de Brienne in the 15th century shows her making careful provisions for her household and choosing not to remarry, demonstrating her right to remain a feme soul and control her own destiny. Even among common people, while parental approval was customary, women were not entirely without agency. Betrothal customs often involved a period of engagement where the couple interacted and mutual affection could develop. The love matches, though perhaps not the norm, were not unheard of, particularly in later medieval periods. Court records sometimes reveal instances where couples sought to marry against parental wishes or where women refused proposed matches. In certain cases, particularly for those of lower status, economic necessity might drive a marriage, but the woman's consent was still part of the social expectation. For example, peasant women often had informal ways of signaling their approval or disapproval of a suitor. An outright refusal could make a marriage very difficult to sustain, even if arranged. The practice of handfasting, or informal marriage contracts, common in some areas, also gave individuals more flexibility. These were agreements between two people, often sealed by an exchange of vows and sexual relations, which the church later struggled to regulate. While not always leading to formal church marriages, they show individuals, including women, exercising personal choice in establishing relationships, sometimes without the direct oversight of their families. Furthermore, medieval literature, while often idealized, portrays heroines who actively resist unwanted marriages or pursue love matches. While these are fictional, they reflect societal understandings of personal agency and the value placed on consent, even if only in an ideal sense. Chaucer's Wife of Bath from the Canterbury Tales is a robust example of a woman who asserts her agency in marriage, explicitly discussing her numerous husbands and her control over her marital relationships. While a fictional character, she embodies a strong female voice asserting choice within marriage. The notion that women were completely powerless in marriage is an oversimplification. While social pressures, economic realities, and family strategies heavily influenced marriage decisions, the legal and religious emphasis on consent, the autonomy of widows, and the informal resistance of common women indicate that medieval women were not entirely passive. Their agency varied by circumstance, but it was present and often asserted in subtle or overt ways within the complex landscape of medieval marital customs. Number 6. Medieval women were constantly pregnant and died young from childbirth. A prevalent and grim image of medieval women is that of perpetual pregnancy, constantly bearing children and facing an almost certain early death from childbirth complications. This myth suggests that their lives were solely defined by reproduction, leading to short lifespans dominated by repeated pregnancies and the high risks associated with them. The narrative often emphasizes the lack of medical knowledge and sanitation, contributing to the idea of inevitable maternal mortality and a short, arduous existence for women. People imagine a scenario where women were almost perpetually confined to their childbed, never recovering fully before the next pregnancy. While childbirth was indeed a dangerous event in the Middle Ages, and infant mortality rates were high, the idea that medieval women were constantly pregnant and universally died young from childbirth is an exaggeration and an oversimplification. Women did not spend their entire adult lives in a state of pregnancy, and many lived to old age. Firstly, constantly pregnant implies an unbroken chain of pregnancies. This overlooks several biological realities and social factors. Breastfeeding, which was common and prolonged in the Middle Ages, often suppresses ovulation, acting as a natural form of birth spacing. While not a guaranteed contraceptive, it could extend the interval between births. Furthermore, medieval diets, often lacking in variety and nutrients, could affect female fertility. As periods of famine or general malnutrition could lead to lower fertility rates or temporary amenorrhea, absence of menstruation, naturally limiting the number of pregnancies. Additionally, the average age of marriage varied. While some girls married young, many women, especially in commoner classes, married in their early to mid-20s, which shortened their reproductive window compared to earlier marriages. Secondly, while maternal mortality was higher than in modern times, it was not an absolute certainty of death. Childbirth was risky, with complications like hemorrhage, infection, and obstructed labor leading to fatalities. However, the death rate for women of reproductive age was not always higher than that for men in the same age group. Other diseases, accidents, and violence also pose significant threats to life for everyone. Estimating precise maternal mortality rates for the Middle Ages is challenging due to limited and scattered data, but modern historical demographers suggest a range that, while high, was not universally fatal to mothers with every birth. For instance, some estimates suggest between 10 to 30 maternal deaths per 1,000 births, which means that while it was a significant risk, most women survived childbirth. Many medieval women lived long lives, surviving multiple pregnancies and reaching old age. we have numerous examples of women who lived well into their 50s, 60s, and beyond. Eleanor of Aquitaine lived to be 82 years old, having borne 10 children. She outlived many of her children and 2 husbands, remaining a politically active figure for decades. Similarly, Margaret Beaufort, mother of Henry VII, lived to be 66 years old despite having only 1 child, demonstrating that even a single birth was not a death sentence and long life was possible. These prominent examples show that longevity was not exclusively a male privilege. Parish registers and court records, where available, show that many women had multiple children but did not die young in childbirth. Families often had children spaced several years apart, indicating natural birth spacing rather than continuous pregnancies. For example, studying medieval English villages through manorial court rolls shows that while many women died in their childbearing years, just as many survived past them, sometimes into their 60s and 70s. The average lifespan, which includes high infant and child mortality, often gives a misleading impression of adult lifespans. If a person survived childhood, their chances of living into their adult years were much higher. Moreover, the support system around childbirth also influenced outcomes. The midwives played a crucial role in assisting births, providing practical knowledge and traditional remedies. While their understanding of germ theory was non-existent, their experience and presence offered vital support. Women in communities often assisted each other during labor, creating a network of care. Childbirth was a communal event, and women relied on each other's help. The common belief also ignores the significant portion of women who did not marry or bear children. Nuns, for example, dedicated their lives to religious service and obviously did not experience childbirth. Many single women, including spinsters or women who chose not to remarry after widowhood, lived full lives independent of procreation. For example, the Beguines, a lay religious movement of women in Northern Europe, chose a life of piety without monastic vows, often living independently and engaging in crafts or charitable work, effectively opting out of traditional marriage and childbearing. Furthermore, the concept of family size in the Middle Ages is often misunderstood. While large families were desirable due to high child mortality, and families often had many children, it was not uncommon for several children to die in infancy or childhood. Thus, while a woman might give birth many times, she might not raise a large number of children to adulthood, which influences the perception of continuous childbearing. The total number of births over a woman's lifetime might be high, but the spacing and the number of surviving children often reveal a less continuous pattern of pregnancy. In conclusion, while childbirth was indeed a perilous event in the Middle Ages, the narrative of medieval women being constantly pregnant and inevitably dying young from its complications is an oversimplification. Many women experienced birth spacing, lived to old age, and navigated the risks of childbirth successfully, supported by traditional practices and community care. Their lives were not solely defined by reproduction, and a significant number of women did not experience pregnancy or childbirth at all. Number 7. Medieval women were all the same, regardless of social class. A common oversight when discussing medieval women is the tendency to generalize their experiences, as if all women lived the same lives, faced identical challenges, and held similar roles, regardless of their social standing. This myth suggests a monolithic medieval woman, ignoring the vast differences in power, privilege, labor, and lifestyle that separated a queen from a peasant or an urban merchant's wife from a secluded nun. It flattens the rich tapestry of medieval female existence into a single, undifferentiated category, failing to acknowledge the profound impact of social class on their daily realities. However, the reality of medieval society was highly stratified, and a woman's social class profoundly shaped every aspect of her life, from her education and legal rights to her daily labor and political influence. To understand medieval women, it is crucial to recognize these distinctions. A queen like Eleanor of Aquitaine 1122 to 1204 lived a life vastly different from that of a peasant woman. Eleanor was born into immense wealth and power, inheriting the Duchy of Aquitaine at a young age. She received an extensive education, was literate in multiple languages, and patronized troubadours and scholars. Her marriages to 2 kings, Louis VII of France and Henry II of England, placed her at the very heart of European politics. She traveled extensively, negotiated treaties, led crusades, and even instigated rebellions. Her political acumen and personal agency were considerable. Her daily life involved courtly rituals, diplomatic correspondence, and overseeing vast royal households. Her legacy is one of immense influence and power, far removed from the daily struggle for survival faced by the majority of women. Contrast Eleanor's life with that of a peasant woman. A peasant woman's life was primarily dictated by agricultural cycles and manual labor. She would have risen before dawn to milk cows, tend to livestock, and prepare food. Her days involved arduous physical tasks in the fields alongside men planting, weeding, harvesting, and gathering fuel. She would also be responsible for domestic chores such as spinning, weaving, baking bread, and brewing ale, often for the household's consumption and sometimes for sale. Her diet would have been simple, often grain-based, and her living conditions humble. Her access to formal education was almost non-existent, and her legal rights, while present, were primarily limited to manorial customs. Her world revolved around her village, her family, and the rhythm of the seasons. She was essential to the survival of her family and the productivity of the manor, but her sphere of influence was localized and her personal comforts few. Noble women, though not queens, also lived lives of relative privilege. They often received an education in literacy, household management, and sometimes even falconry or embroidery. Their marriages were often arranged to secure alliances or consolidate family power, but they might bring significant dowries of land or wealth. They managed large households, oversaw numerous servants, and often administered their husbands' estates in his absence, requiring significant administrative and financial skills. Now, women like Agnes Paston, circa 1420 to 1479, were instrumental in managing complex family estates, handling tenants, and navigating legal disputes, as evidenced by the vast collection of Paston letters. While they might not wield royal power, their influence within their feudal domains was substantial. Urban women, particularly those from mercantile families, inhabited a different world again. They might live in bustling towns surrounded by trade and craft. Many were actively involved in family businesses, working as shopkeepers, artisans, or traders. They learned literacy and numeracy to manage accounts and correspond with merchants. For instance, women were prominent in the textile trades, brewing, and baking, often running their own independent businesses, especially as widows. The legal concept of feme sole merchant in some towns allowed married women to operate businesses independently of their husbands, giving them significant economic autonomy. Their access to goods, information, and social networks was far greater than that of a rural peasant. Women in religious orders, such as nuns and abbesses, formed another distinct social group. Nuns, often from noble or wealthy backgrounds, entered convents not only for spiritual devotion but also for education, intellectual pursuits, or as a respectable alternative to marriage. Or abbesses, like Hildegard of Bingen, 1098 to 1179, governed vast monastic estates, wielded significant spiritual and temporal power, corresponded with popes and emperors, and contributed to scholarship, music, and medicine. Their lives were structured by monastic rules, but they often had considerable autonomy and influence, enjoying a level of intellectual and spiritual independence rarely afforded to women outside religious orders. The clothes they wore, the food they ate, the housing they lived in, the health care they received, and the legal protections available to them all varied dramatically based on their social standing. A queen wore silks and furs, ate richly spiced meats, lived in castles, and had access to the best physicians. A peasant woman wore coarse wool and linen, ate pottage and bread, lived in a small cottage, and relied on local healers or traditional remedies. To lump these experiences together as the medieval woman is to miss the nuances and complexities of medieval society and the diverse lives women led within it. Their lives were shaped not just by their gender, but powerfully by their place within the social hierarchy. Number 8 medieval women were seen only as weak and sinful. A deeply entrenched myth portrays medieval women as being viewed almost exclusively through two narrow lenses, either as weak, frail creatures in constant need of male protection, or as inherently sinful temptresses, primarily associated with Eve's original sin and the downfall of humanity. This perception suggests that medieval thought, heavily influenced by the church, uniformly depicted women as morally corrupt, intellectually inferior, and physically feeble. It implies that society had a singular negative view of womanhood, undermining their capabilities and moral standing. This idea suggests that women were always blamed for societal ills and seen as agents of temptation. However, historical and theological evidence reveals a much more complex and contradictory view of women in the Middle Ages. While negative stereotypes certainly existed, often rooted in classical philosophical traditions and certain interpretations of Christian scripture, they coexisted with powerful positive portrayals and roles for women. The veneration of the Virgin Mary stands as a monumental counterpoint to the sinful temptress image. Mary was revered as the epitome of purity, grace, compassion, and divine motherhood. She was considered sinless, the new Eve who redeemed humanity through her obedience and faith. Her cult grew immensely popular throughout the Middle Ages, influencing art, literature, and popular devotion. More cathedrals were dedicated to her, countless hymns and prayers composed in her honor, and images of her as Queen of Heaven or Madonna and Child were ubiquitous. Her example provided a powerful model of virtuous womanhood, contradicting the idea of universal female sinfulness. She was seen as a powerful intercessor with God, demonstrating strength and spiritual authority, not weakness. Beyond Mary, numerous female saints were widely celebrated and emulated. Figures like Mary Magdalene, despite her traditional association with sin, was often portrayed as a powerful penitent and a crucial witness to Christ's resurrection, inspiring devotion and highlighting redemption. Saints, such as Catherine of Siena, Bridget of Sweden, and Clare of Assisi, were revered for their intellect, piety, spiritual visions, and active roles in founding religious orders or advising popes and rulers. These women were seen as strong, courageous, and divinely inspired, offering examples of female moral and spiritual fortitude far from weakness. For example, Catherine of Siena, 1347 to 1380, was a Dominican mystic and laywoman who played a significant role in papal politics, advising Gregory XI to return to Rome from Avignon. She traveled, preached, and corresponded with powerful figures, demonstrating immense spiritual and intellectual strength. Women were also celebrated for their earthly virtues and strength. In chivalric literature, while women were sometimes portrayed as passive objects of courtly love, they were also depicted as intelligent, resourceful, and even formidable. Queen Guinevere, though flawed, was a powerful queen. Her characters, like the Lady of the Lake in Arthurian romances, wielded immense magical power and wisdom. Heroines in popular romances often displayed courage, loyalty, and intelligence, challenging the notion of inherent female weakness. These stories, widely read and enjoyed, presented complex female characters. Furthermore, secular society recognized and valued women's strength in various practical spheres. Peasant women performed grueling physical labor in the fields, demonstrating undeniable physical resilience. Urban women managed businesses, negotiated deals, and ran households, requiring shrewdness and determination. Noblewomen often managed vast estates in their husband's absence, acting as regents, administering justice, and defending family lands. These were roles that demanded strength, competence, and leadership, challenging any notion of universal female fragility or inability. For instance, the Empress Matilda 1102 to 1167 fought a civil war for the English throne against her cousin Stephen, demonstrating immense political and military resolve. While she did not secure the throne herself, her campaign showed her as a strong and determined leader, not a weak figure. The weak stereotype is further challenged by the existence of female warriors and leaders, albeit rare. Joan of Arc circa 1412 to 1431 is the most famous example, leading French armies to victory, but there were others. Women occasionally took up arms to defend castles during sieges, or participated in urban militias, demonstrating courage and physical capability when necessary. Accounts from the Hundred Years' War describe women defending their homes and communities from invaders. The concept of women as sinful was not universally applied. While some theological writings, particularly ascetic ones, highlighted Eve's sin and warned against female temptation, many other theologians and popular preachers emphasized women's capacity for piety, virtue, and salvation. Confessors and spiritual guides often encouraged women's spiritual development, recognizing their deep faith and devotion. Women were often seen as more pious than men, more likely to attend church, and more receptive to religious teaching. The portrayal of women in medieval art also provides insight. While some images depict Eve as a temptress, many more show scenes of female saints performing miracles, abbesses leading their communities, queens patronizing arts and learning, and Mary at the center of Christian devotion. These images celebrated female strength, holiness, and leadership. In conclusion, the medieval view of women was far from monolithic. While negative stereotypes existed, they were balanced by powerful counter-narratives celebrating female piety, strength, leadership, and virtue. The overwhelming veneration of the Virgin Mary, the reverence for numerous female saints, the practical recognition of women's economic and political contributions, and the depictions of strong female characters in literature all contradict the idea that medieval women were seen only as weak and sinful. They were viewed in a multifaceted way, reflecting the complex realities of their roles in society and religious life. Number 9. Medieval women had no economic power or involvement in trade. A common misconception is that medieval women were entirely excluded from economic life and held no real financial power. This myth often suggests that trade, commerce, and earning a living were exclusively male domains, leaving women solely dependent on male relatives for their economic survival. It paints a picture of women as passive consumers rather than active producers or proprietors, disconnected from the bustling markets and the mechanisms of wealth creation. The idea is that women had no hand in the economy, their roles limited to household consumption and management of a domestic budget handed to them. However, historical evidence conclusively demonstrates that medieval women were deeply embedded in the economy at all levels, from daily agricultural labor to sophisticated international trade. They were active producers, merchants, property owners, and wage earners, wielding significant economic power in various contexts. In the agrarian economy, which dominated medieval Europe, women were indispensable. Peasant women worked alongside men in the fields, performing crucial tasks such as planting, weeding, harvesting, and gathering fuel. Their labor was vital for the family's survival and for producing surplus goods. They also managed kitchen gardens, raised small livestock like chickens and pigs, and processed agricultural products into food, drink, and textiles. For instance, women were often responsible for spinning wool into thread and weaving linen or wool cloth, a labor-intensive process central to household self-sufficiency and often to local trade. Manorial records frequently list women as holders of customary land, paying rents or services, which indicates their direct involvement in the land-based economy. In urban centers, women were highly active in craft production and trade. Many women ran their own businesses, especially if they were widows who inherited their husband's trade. Their guild records from cities like London, Paris, and Cologne show women as active members, masters, and apprentices in various trades. They worked as brewers, bakers, textile workers, mercers, dyers, embroiderers, parchment makers, and even goldsmiths. In Paris, for example, the Livre de Métiers Book of Trades from the late 13th century lists specific trades where women were masters, often in textile and luxury goods industries. These women not only produced goods, but also managed workshops, employed apprentices, and sold their products directly to customers in the marketplace. The brewing industry, in particular, was heavily dominated by women. Ale was a staple drink, and alewives brewed and sold ale from their homes, often identifiable by the ale stake or bush outside their door. This was a significant source of income for many women and a vital contribution to urban sustenance. Records often show women being fined for breaching brewing regulations, which only confirms their active involvement and commercial success in this trade. Other women were also significant figures in retail and street vending. They sold foodstuffs, textiles, and other goods in town markets. Their presence in the marketplace was ubiquitous, indicating their active participation in the commercial life of the city. These women were not just selling small quantities, some were substantial merchants, dealing in larger quantities of goods and managing complex transactions. For instance, in 14th century England, some women were involved in the wool trade, a major economic driver. Beyond direct production and retail, women played crucial roles in financial management. Noblewomen and abbesses often managed vast estates, controlling significant revenues from rents, agricultural produce, and various feudal dues. They oversaw budgets, handled accounts, and made strategic financial decisions. Margaret Beaufort, mother of Henry VII, was renowned for her shrewd management of her extensive lands, demonstrating significant economic acumen and power. In merchant families, wives frequently assisted in running the family business, keeping ledgers, handling correspondence, and sometimes even traveling to manage distant branches. Margherita Dettini, wife of the merchant Francesco Dettini, managed the family business in Prato, Italy, corresponding with agents and overseeing transactions, proving her direct involvement in complex financial operations. Moreover, women could own property independently, especially single women and widows. A widow often inherited a dower right to a portion of her husband's land, giving her control over its income and management. This allowed her significant economic autonomy. Many medieval wills show women making bequests, inheriting property, and entering into contracts, which directly proves their economic standing. In some urban centers, the custom of feme sole merchant allowed married women to operate their own businesses and be legally responsible for their debts and contracts, distinct from their husband's finances. This was a crucial legal mechanism that allowed women to participate independently in trade. Even in professions like healing, women were often compensated for their services. Midwives and herbalists earned a living by providing medical care, demonstrating their economic contribution through specialized skills. Some women even served as moneylenders, providing small loans within their communities, a direct form of financial power. In essence, the economic roles of medieval women were diverse and indispensable. They were not merely confined to the domestic sphere, but were active participants in agriculture, crafts, trade, and financial management. Their labor, entrepreneurial spirit, and property ownership were fundamental to the functioning of the medieval economy, directly challenging the myth of their economic powerlessness. Number 10. Medieval women had no influence in politics or leadership. A pervasive myth suggests that medieval women were entirely excluded from politics and leadership, confined to private lives with no direct involvement in the governance of kingdoms, states, or even local communities. This view often portrays medieval political spheres as exclusively male domains, where women held no formal power, offered no advice, and certainly never ruled. The idea is that women were considered incapable of leadership, their counsel ignored, and their presence in political decision-making tables non-existent. This leads to an image of medieval women as mere bystanders to the grand political narratives of the era. However, historical records vividly demonstrate that medieval women, across various social strata, wielded significant political influence and exercised direct leadership in numerous capacities, often shaping the course of history. Their involvement was multifaceted, ranging from regency and direct rule to diplomacy, patronage, and local governance. Queens and noblewomen frequently acted as regents for their minor sons or absent husbands. This was a formal and often powerful role that placed them at the head of government. A regent held executive power, could issue laws, negotiate treaties, and command armies. For instance, Blanche of Castile, 1188 to 1252, mother of King Louis IX of France, served as regent for her young son for many years. She was a formidable politician, successfully quelling baronial revolts, managing royal finances, and ensuring stability during a challenging period. Her political acumen and firm hand in governance were widely recognized and respected, even by her adversaries. Another powerful regent was Empress Matilda, 1102 to 1167, who fought a protracted civil war in England for her claim to the throne, demonstrating immense political ambition and military leadership, even if ultimately unsuccessful in securing the crown for herself. These women were not merely figureheads, but active rulers. Some women even ruled in their own right, inheriting titles and lands. Eleanor of Aquitaine, 1122 to 1204, was Duchess of Aquitaine in her own right, controlling vast territories and wielding immense feudal power before her marriages. She was a sovereign ruler, demonstrating direct political authority over a large duchy. Other women, like Isabella I of Castile, 1451 to 1504, who co-ruled with Ferdinand of Aragon, were powerful monarchs who shaped their kingdom's destinies. Isabella played a critical role in the unification of Spain, the Reconquista, and the sponsorship of Columbus's voyage, showing her as a major force in national and international politics. Beyond direct rule, noblewomen often acted as significant political players through their patronage networks and diplomatic roles. They fostered alliances through marriage, exchanged political intelligence through letters, and served as intermediaries in disputes. They hosted powerful individuals in their households, influencing opinions and decisions through informal channels. For example, in the intricate web of feudal relationships, a noblewoman's connections and influence could be crucial in securing loyalty or mediating conflicts among powerful lords. So abbesses, as heads of large monastic communities, also exercised considerable political and economic power. They governed extensive estates, managed large numbers of people, and often had direct access to secular rulers and powerful bishops. They were often skilled administrators and diplomats, representing their institution's interests in complex legal and political disputes. The Abbess of Quedlinburg in Germany, for example, held princely rank within the Holy Roman Empire, commanding her own secular forces and participating in imperial diets. These women ruled over significant territories and populations, demonstrating leadership beyond spiritual matters. At a local level, women were often involved in manorial governance. Widows, in particular, frequently held the lease of the manor, or the right to manage their dower lands. This meant they often presided over manorial courts, collected rents, enforced local customs, and managed agricultural production. These responsibilities required significant administrative skill and the ability to exercise authority over tenants and serfs. The records from these courts show women acting as significant economic and judicial figures in their local communities. For example, in the court rolls of the Manor of Wakefield, numerous women are recorded as landowners, litigants, and sometimes even as court officials, actively participating in the legal and administrative life of their villages. Women also influenced politics through spiritual and intellectual means. Visionaries and mystics like Hildegard of Bingen, 1098 to 1179, and Catherine of Siena, 1347 to 1380, corresponded with popes, emperors, and kings, offering them moral guidance, criticism, and political advice based on their perceived divine revelations. Their spiritual authority gave them a unique platform to influence powerful figures, often challenging their actions with divine authority. Their letters are filled with direct exhortations and warnings to the most powerful men in Europe, demonstrating an undeniable form of political influence. And furthermore, women provided political stability through the production of heirs and the forging of dynastic alliances. While this was a biological role, the strategic planning and careful negotiation of royal and noble marriages were fundamental political acts in which women were central figures, even if not always the primary decision makers. The very existence of female lines of succession, even if through male heirs, meant that women were inextricably linked to the political stability and future of dynasties. In essence, the political landscape of the Middle Ages was not devoid of female leadership. From powerful queens and regents who steered kingdoms through crises, to abbesses who governed vast territories, to local women who managed manors and participated in communal governance, medieval women exercised political influence and direct leadership in diverse and often profound ways. To ignore their contributions is to present an incomplete and misleading picture of medieval history.